and cash flow statements, and this is a very important metric in order for us to manage the business more closely. We have designed our high-level business models. We've implemented operating models, and that, I think, is working quite well in determining what we do, where we do it, and who's responsible. That's been accompanied by a lot of focus on delegations of authority to ensure that when we go through this change, that we do so in a well-governed and well-structured way. And we're in the process of now implementing organization structures as the next step. We've also set out our trading model, understanding that the primary drive behind the unbundling exercise, the restructuring exercise, is to enable Eskom and the transmission entity in particular to attract new investment in generation. That is what the country needs. We have a significant generation capacity gap, and the sooner that we can get new capacity onto the grid, the better. And therefore, again, we recognize the efforts of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy and also of the IPP office in this regard to expedite and accelerate the addition of new capacity onto the grid. So we have some work to do still in the remaining 3 months of this financial year. We will be putting in place the final touches to our governance structures. We will finalize our organization structures, populate those organization structures, and then ensure that we can conclude on transfer pricing principles and put the final internal power purchase and electricity supply agreements in place. Once that has been achieved, we will be able to deliver on our key mandate of legal separation of the transmission entity into an ITSMO, an independent transmission system and market operator, which is a key enabler of this additional investment and generation capacity in South Africa. We have achieved all of our milestones except for the population of the organization structure. And as I've said, that's ongoing and should be in place by March of next year. We have also submitted a Public Finance Management Act application to our shareholder, DPE, as well as to National Treasury, requesting permission for the establishment of a subsidiary which will house the ITSMO. So that will accommodate all of our transmission activities. We wrote that letter in November, and we're very pleased to report that we've already received a positive response from government in the current month. So there was a very short response time there, for which we're obviously very grateful. We now need to figure out exactly what belongs where in terms of transmission and distribution. We've agreed on the principles of that, and we're now separating out those activities. And then we can transfer all of these assets, and bearing in mind the complexity of the business, this is quite a complex exercise, but we know what the job at hand is, and we are implementing that. All of these internal and external dependencies are obviously critical to allow us to deliver on this key activity. And again, it is very important that we obtain the necessary license transfers, and that we also get approvals for the relevant applications, and that the required policy and regulatory reforms are implemented to support this. So with that, I want to thank you for your attendance and your attention today, and I would now like to hand over to our Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Caleb Cassim, to take you through the numbers. Caleb, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Andre. So getting into our financial performance for the 6 months, our financial turnaround is still focused on our income statement and our balance sheet. And unpacking this has 4 key areas. Number 1 being the migration towards cost-reflective tariffs. And you can see there we've had a number of court applications and judgments with the regulator, which is currently in the process of being implemented. Also understanding there is an appeal process relating to the MYPD 469 billion. The second key component is Eskom's own ability to extract efficiencies and cost reductions, both in terms of operating costs as well as capital expenditure. Like Andre has indicated, that we see for the first 6 months that our coal costs are sitting at inflationary increases, and importantly, to collect the amount of revenue which is due to us, in particular from customers that are in arrears, the municipalities that were touched on, and most importantly, how do we then address our significant level of debt that sits on the balance sheet. And as we've said at year-end, and again for interims, when you read the detailed reports, the importance of the government equity that allows for us to meet our cash flow requirements in terms of debt service cover. Andre has explained the implications in terms of COVID on our revenue, and I'll touch on that a bit later. But importantly as well, we've seen since we last spoke the credit ratings to one, the sovereign, and then the implications which followed on Eskom being downgraded by Moody's as well as Fitch. If colleagues, we then move on to the next slide. Most importantly, understanding this is September, it's a seasonal business for Eskom. You would find the results up until the 6 months are most of the time in the positive and favorable, but the pressure comes in the second 6 months, which I'll touch on shortly. Financial ratios improves marginally compared year on year. September 2019 has been restated for the Kusile impairment and overpayments of 4 billion. That's reflected in the restatement. You will see that at an EBITDA level, a slight improvement of about 2 billion rand year on year, and your operating profit has similarly improved from 12.9 billion to 14.3 billion. As Andre explained, the 83 billion profit. We've generated just enough cash to cover our interest bill with that cash interest cover of 1, and therefore by implication, we don't have enough to pay for the capital and the principal on our debt, which is owing. That debt service cover reflected at 0.44 is reflected in our cash flows and the need for the government support. Obviously, on the back of the 49 billion for March 2020 and the 6 billion that has flowed through until the end of September, we find the improvement in our debt equity ratio from 2.94 in 2019 to 2.53 at September 2020, culminating in that improvement of gearing to 72%. If we then move on to the next slide and looking at our income statement year on year, as mentioned, the tariffs were effectively offset by the drop in volumes, leaving you an increase in revenue of just under 1 billion rand from 107.5 to 108.7 billion. Primary energy has come in at 4% higher than September 19 on the back of the higher utilization of OCGTs, both in terms of the Eskom plant as well as the IPPs, and additional production and extra imports that were purchased during the 6 months. We've mentioned that the coal costs have escalated by 4.6% since March 2020. and you find that your EBITDA improved by 6%. Moving down with depreciation remaining relatively flat year on year, we see that your operating profit, that improvement to 14.2 billion rand. Your fair value adjustments on the back of the strengthening of the rand posted a positive impact to the performance of 1.1 billion. And then taking out your 15 billion finance costs leaves you with a bottom line profit of 83 million compared to a loss last year after the restatement of 1.9 billion rand. If I then move on to the sales volumes, Andre has spoken about this with the 10.7 terawatt reduction year on year through industrial sectors being impacted by a reduction of 17.6% and as well as the impact of commodity prices. As usual, we do account for the defaulting customers. We do not recognize that revenue. And for IFRS 15, we did not recognize 4.6 billion for this period to September 2020, up on last year 4.1 billion. And while the other units are still being in the process of commissioned, we've capitalized pre-commissioning revenue at the end of September 2020 of 1.4 billion, then giving us a total impact of 108 billion rand, 0.7 billion for revenue. You can see then the split between both domestic as well as international sales, both dropping year on year, close to 10 terawatts domestically and a further terawatt from international sales. If we then move on to our next slide, this is just unpacking what we produced during the first 6 months, and we compare it to September on September with the different category of costs and what the equivalent rand per megawatt hour is. I think firstly, just to make sure that when people review this slide in particular, take note of the footnote 3. At an IPP level, when you look at the renewable and the OCGT costs, that's the total cost included. It's the variable costs, including the fixed cost elements and the return. Whereas the costs that are reflected for Eskom or coal, nuclear, etc., those are only the variable primary energy costs. O&M and return components are not included in there. So you can't just compare the 385 rand per megawatt of coal to the 2,244 rand per megawatt for renewable IPPs. That is not a pure apples and apples comparison. So take note of item number 3. But what's important is we know Eskom's total selling price, including generation, transmission, and distribution, is around about 105 cents per kilowatt. If one assumes that generation is around 75% to 80% of that, by implication, when you compare an apples and apples, Eskom's total generation cost would give you about 80 cents per kilowatt, and then you compare that to the renewable IPPs. That is the apples and apples. Why we disclose this? Because it's primary energy and its production cost from an IFRS perspective, we disclose it under primary energy. But I thought it was very important to clarify that. I think the other important factor when you look at renewables as well, in particular, just looking at the rand per megawatt is important, but one must remember the load factors. A renewable IPP doesn't have a load factor like a coal-powered station. Probably sitting on average, maybe renewables on PV and wind around 35% to 40%, whereas a coal plant, which is base load, is literally double that. So that factor must also be taken into account when you just compare the absolute rand per megawatts and what you're going to pay to produce the same amount of electricity. Having said all of that, when you compare across Eskom's cost base, you see that our coal costs have increased by 5% year on year, from 367 Rand per megawatt to 385 Rand per megawatt. Nuclear obviously being the cheapest source of our portfolio at this point in time at 105 Rand per megawatt hour. And OCGTs both are from a IPP perspective as well as Eskom being the most expensive sources. And that's why the importance of making sure we deliver on that needed generation, EAF and performance to reduce the reliance on those expensive sources. Overall, we see that our primary energy has increased from 52 billion last year to 54 billion for September 2020. If I then proceed, and the balance sheet, as we said at year end, it's stabilized through the government support. And just to highlight a few items, firstly, the equity growth from September 2019 from 162 billion Rand to just under 187 billion Rand. We see that our debt securities and borrowings are growing on a gross basis from 454 billion to 463.7 billion Rand. And then our liquid assets and cash equivalents improving from September 2019 of 19 billion to just under 25 billion, an improvement of 31%. Our derivatives held for risk management, effectively following the improvement of the exchange rates and our hedging policy, we see that that book has improved from 28 billion Rand last year to 36.7 billion for September 2020. Your debt, as we've said, we're looking at our finance cost being the second largest item behind primary energy. Gross finance charges at 23 billion for the 6 months. After taking into account finance income and borrowing costs which are capitalized of 6.7 billion, you get a net finance cost of 15 billion Rand for the first 6 months, quite similar to the previous year. What we've seen during the first 6 months, we've raised 13 billion Rand worth of debt, and based on our maturity profile, have repaid 24 billion Rand, excluding commercial paper, at an average cost of debt of 9.89%. And you can also see that on a net basis, there's been a slight improvement from 424 billion to 420 billion worth of debt. I think, colleagues, it's important to also note that gross finance cost, if you recall from the income statement, we spent 16 billion Rand on employee benefits, and our capital expenditure for the first 6 months was just under 11 billion Rand, reiterating the point that we need to address the finance costs and, more importantly, the debt balance that sits in the balance sheet. What do we need to raise as Eskom during FY21 compared to our year-end results presentation, where the target was 31 billion worth of funding? We've increased that now by another 10 billion Rand to just under 41 billion, of which, as Andre said, we just secured slightly below 50% to date. We're confident that we can fill the remaining by March with our treasury team and the support, obviously, of government in terms of guarantees, of which 25 billion is available to Eskom at the end of September, understanding the necessary processes and governance that needs to occur internally at Eskom and through DPE and National Treasury. Just to remind the audience that as guaranteed debt matures and is repaid, that tranche then becomes available again to Eskom to tap into following the necessary processes. But again, to have a debt service commitment of 94 billion rand for the year. I mean, 52 weeks, that's almost 2 billion rand worth of debt service commitments for the year that Eskom needs to finance, and our cash from operations is far from achieving that. Going forward, we see the maturity profile. It does decrease, but it still remains significant at 70 billion for FY22 and followed by around 60 billion rand the remaining 3 years. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, if we move on, the point we've highlighted earlier, that our cash from operations of 19 billion was just enough to cover our interest at an interest cover of 1, and effectively leaving us after capital expenditure and raising of debt and repayment of debt with a gap of 17 billion rand, hence reinforcing the need for the government support, which we are grateful for, that is required during the financial year. If we had to try to service that from cost initiatives alone, it would equate to 23% of all our controllable operating costs. And as you've seen, employee benefits and OPEX, we believe are getting it under control, and even primary energy is reducing. Obviously, the pressure comes from the need of OCGTs. If I move on to the municipal arrears, as was highlighted, from March 2020, we've increased by 17% to 32.9 billion rand, with payment levels at municipalities, excluding metros, at 80%, and your top 20 defaulting municipality payment level sitting at 49%. We are working with the Eskom political task team and the multidisciplinary revenue committee to find permanent solution to this municipal debt challenge, led by Monde and the team. And we can see that from a Soweto arrear debt, an increase of 1% for the first 6 months, from 12.8 billion to 13.2 billion. When we look at our other customer base, there's 2 large customers, combined arrears of 700 million, each of them more than 100 million each. If we then touch on our irregular expenditure and our trend since year end, a growth from 33.1 billion to 34.6 billion, with new irregular expenditures for the first 6 months coming from 7 transactions totaling 156 million, apologies. And while we clean up the prior year, 200 million rand linked to prior year cleanup, as well as we continue to spend on existing irregular expenditure that have come through for the first 6 months, it added another 1.2 billion rand. We are still working with DPE and National Treasury.
All right, we're going to come out of the Eskom briefing there on their half-year financial results, reporting a profit of 3 million rand as opposed to the 1.96 billion rand in the year prior. My colleague Arabile Gumere will have more news for you at the top of the hour.